Everybody, and welcome to CDE Virtual. It's my pleasure to welcome former President Kgalema Motlanthe to this platform tonight, a former prisoner on Robben Island for a decade, General Secretary of the National Union of Mine Workers in the 1990s, ANC Secretary General for 10 years after that, elected Deputy President of the ANC in 2007, and a few months later was elected President of the Republic, a position he held for the next about 8 months until the general election of 2009. Since that time, he has continued to hold many positions and contribute to society. He's operated in civil society, he's established and leads his own foundation, and he's chairman of a number of important committees in the ANC. It's a privilege to have you on CDE Conversations tonight. Welcome, Mr. President.
Good evening, Ann, and good evening to other fellow participants.
Thank you. I first met or encountered the President when he was chairman of a parliamentary panel that was charged with looking at all the laws that had been passed since 1994 to help improve South Africa and to deal with poverty and unemployment. This was a very important report that was made to Parliament, and we decided at CDE that we would summarize this document so that more people would have access to it. We did this ruthlessly and delivered a whole lot of copies to the President's Foundation. And well, he's still talking to me. So tonight you're going to get him not summarized, but direct. And we'll get straight into my many questions. In a 2007 BBC interview, you said that the ANC was so bad that they should lose in order to have a chance at renewal or rebuilding themselves. What did you mean then? And do you still believe this should happen?
Yes, and in that interview, what I basically said was that the ANC doesn't seem to be getting the message that it is performing so poorly that the electorate and general South African populace is increasingly losing confidence in the ANC. And what I was basically conveying was that it needs to hear this message and failing which the only other way in which it could perhaps get the message loud and clear is if it were to lose elections, so that those who think that the ANC is nothing but, a channel to largesse and looting, would then leave, and the ANC, genuine adherents would then embark on a process of rebuilding it and restoring, its morals and values, as it were.
I think you came under a lot of attack at the time for what you said.
Oh, yes. Well, but of course now the leadership of the ANC accepts that unless they do something about the trajectory on which they are orbiting, there's no doubt that they will lose elections and eventually be irrelevant to the South African polity, as it were.
Now, in 2007, when you were General Secretary of the ANC, you knew, and I think your report to Congress that year indicated how much corruption there was. You knew that the party was starting to be overwhelmed by corruption. When you think back on that time, was there more that you could have done to prevent the ANC going down the path that it has gone down? Can you tell us a bit more about what you did, what powers you had, at that time and what you tried to do?
Well, my main responsibility was, that of being the, key administrator of the ANC, if you like, and because the president is the political head of the organization. So I was responsible for ensuring that the structures and membership, function according to the constitution of the ANC. And in the course of, doing that work, it became clear to me that the ANC was not only beginning to be affected by, corruption of money, which venality, and that over and above that, there was, beginning, signs that the ANC was also going to suffer from corruption of ethics, and that's really what was of a great bother to me, and of course also not only to me but to the senior leaders of the ANC as well as the elders. We still had at that time the older generation of the ANC alive and around, and in their feedback to me, it was clear that there were concerns that nothing had prepared the ANC for being a governing party, and that even though in an earlier conference in 1992, we actually, I recall very clearly that we discussed the difficulties that would come with the ANC ascending into power and government, and that gifts are the frontline soldiers of corruption. And I recall in one commission we were discussing how ANC members should be trained and assisted to know how to deal with gifts, because people offer gifts and they ask for no favor in return, only to return a few months down the line and ask for a favor. And if you feel indebted, you then feel obliged to do help, and that's how honest people get sucked into corrupt activities here. So this was a concern. It was also a concern because they were beginning to manipulate processes of internal democracy, such as nomination of candidates for leadership positions and so on. And it's, if you think of it, that in itself is an act of corruption.
Yes. Did the leaders at the time, this was a very difficult situation. What did you try and do you brought it to everyone's attention, people knew about it. What did you try and do? How did you see sort of remedying this?
Well, like a political organization, you always, lay emphasis on orientating and inducting new members. But the problem is not only restricted to new members. It's the older members who, fail to deal with gifts, as I said. Now that the ANC was a governing party, people occupy positions of influence, and so they end up being sucked into corrupt activities. And so my responsibility really was to ensure, because remember, I as the Secretary General present to conference, National Elective Conference, a report on behalf of the National Executive Committee. And in that report, I clearly stated that NEC members were not immune from the corrupt, activities, and that as the NEC we should take responsibility, and also called on because it was an elective conference, called on the incoming NEC to basically investigate and ensure that there are consequences, for wrongdoing. Yeah.
I assume that didn't happen after your report.
Well, it just go that report. If you read it today, it would basically serve as a basis for renewal, because whereas we were dealing with a situation that was based on signs that the value systems and democratic practices and mores were being eroded. We were still concerned about that erosion. Today, I mean, the problem is far much more deep-rooted, across the board. At that time, you could still appeal to the National Executive Committee. The people were still, prone to frown upon wrongdoing. Today, I mean, it's business as usual here.
Yeah. Mm. So in 2011, we know that Trevor Manuel told us, and others have confirmed, that members of the cabinet were being appointed by the Guptas. They knew about their appointment before the president told them, but from the Guptas. Was this ever discussed in the NEC or any official ANC body once this became known, that cabinet ministers were being appointed elsewhere, if I can put it that way? Was there any formal discussion anywhere?
Yes, there was a formal discussion in one of the National Executive Committee meetings, at which meeting, as part of those discussions, the Minister Kgalema Motlanthe actually said he knew about this because he actually got a congratulatory message from one of the Guptas for being appointed even before he was formally appointed. So it was in the course of the NEC discussing that very issue that these people have undue influence in the workings of government. And remember, the heads of the intelligence at the time, Gibson Jenje and Mo Sheikh, had also been, relieved of their responsibilities after they had tried to investigate these Guptas here. So the concern was there even at that time, but the reality is that the National Executive Committee itself had already been captured at that time, not by the Guptas. This is a different type of capture, if you like, because the number of cabinet ministers as well as deputy cabinet ministers was increased to 72. That was the largest it had ever been. In fact, the largest was at 34. Now it was 72, and all of them were appointed from amongst the members of the National Executive Committee, and so in that cabinet, they relate to the president as their employer. And when they come back into the NEC, 72 of them relate to the president as their employer. So first the ANC had to be captured and it was the national, that's how the National Executive Committee was captured.
Mm.
And that then led, made it easier for the state to be captured here.
Yes. I'm going to come back to some of those difficult issues in a moment. Now, we know that there are a number of people in the private sector and the public sector who participated in the industrial scale corruption we've come to call state capture. I want to talk a bit about that.
Yeah.
How do you think the ANC should deal with the findings of the Zondo Commission? We haven't got all the reports, but we've got a lot, and we've had years of testimony. How do you see this? What do you think? What would be satisfactory and appropriate in your view for how the ANC deals with very senior people right to the cabinet who have been named for corruption, alleged corruption in those reports?
Well, the ANC has a few instruments, that would enable it to deal with this issue, because the Zondo Commission report will no doubt result in prosecutions of those who are, fingered in the report. And as far as the ANC is concerned, those, once they are charged, the ANC already has a step-aside rule that they should step aside from their responsibilities until their names are cleared in a court of law. And the ANC constitution actually, if you are then convicted by a court of law for corruption or any such serious offense, the ANC constitution then prescribed that you are no longer eligible to be a member, therefore you stand expelled from the ANC. Yeah.
So how confident are you that this is going to actually happen? We have a few cases at the moment. The head of the ANC Women's League is a case in points, and others. Are you confident this will happen?
Well, yes, I'm confident because it's the law, you see, and that's it's not dependent on the ANC's likes and dislikes. It's the law, and so the law would be applied effectively. In the case of the Batabile Dlamini, once again, the law creates an exit pass, because the law says if you are convicted for any offense and with an option of a fine, then you have no criminal record. And that's how, if you recall, in the early days of the travel gate, that's how most of them remained in parliament, simply because they were sentenced to less than 6 months imprisonment with an option of a fine, and they all paid the fines and continued. At an level of ethics and morality, that's not, no public representative should really, go into office when they have been guilty of, betraying trust, you see. But, the law, as I say, creates this exit pass.
It's worrying that members of a political party will vote for people who so clearly are corrupt or have so many allegations against them of murder or corruption. It's a big challenge for a political party that its own members don't seem to see the Constitution and the rule of law or corruption as so important. how does a party deal with that? How do you reclaim the party in that sense when its own members and branches have been so corrupted, or I'm not sure what the right word is?
Yeah. Well, you need, the leadership can act against that decisively if the leadership itself is not, compromised in one way or the other. Because the constitution of the ANC actually is straightforward on such matters. But if the leadership is, itself, in a sense, as they say, having small skeletons in their carpets, then it leads to paralysis. It leads to failure to act against, such obvious acts of, malfeasance and so on.
Were you surprised by any of the findings that emerged through the Zondo Commission process? Or did they confirm things you knew already, or was there anything in particular that took you by surprise?
No, well, as far as, the one thing that, one, was taken aback by was the whole issue of Bosasa, that, they were essentially running correctional services. That for me was really an eye-opener, that a whole, correctional services could be decided by a service provider such as Bosasa. That I think was a real shock. The other issues of the Guptas and so on, one was already aware of those kinds of problems.
Right.
I mean, these breakfast shows, which were funded by state-owned enterprises and the SABC, it was clear that there's something that wasn't correct. I mean, the newspaper, the departments were buying this newspaper, New Age. You got onto an SAA flight, and this is what they were offering free of charge, but they actually paid for it. It was clear that lots of rot was taking place there.
Can I ask, you were the deputy president to President Zuma for 5 years.
Yes.
When you reflect back on that period, what were the most difficult issues for you or choices? And do you feel if you and other leaders had spoken out in public more, that this might have helped? Was there anything with hindsight, which is always easy to talk about, anything in hindsight that you think you could have done differently, or other senior leaders who were not corrupted or co-opted could have done in that period?
Yeah. Remember, Ann, that I became president ahead of President Zuma, so he's my successor. And yes. So when I served as his deputy, I could always say to him, look, Mr. President, as a president, no president does things the way you do them. So I could talk to him in those terms. And most cabinet committee meetings were chaired by myself, and quite a number of cabinet meetings he asked me to chair them, and he would be in and out and so on. So I could actually talk to him properly about these things, and say to him, this is not how we do it, but he wouldn't listen. Well, part of his skill is that he would never argue with you. He would not rebut what you are saying, but he'll go and act the way he wants to act here.
And if there'd been more talk about all of this outside the party structures, which I know would have been difficult, would that have, do you think that might have helped in any way, or anything one could have done with hindsight to prevent the country going down this terrible road that we have gone down?
Well, short of, removing President Zuma and electing a different leader, there's very little that could have been done, because he had the authority as head of state to appoint and remove ministers even. So, you could say whatever you wanted to say, it would not cut it as long as he was president. I mean, the discussions were always, candid and based on trying to do right. But of course, with his authority, he could go and still do what his benefactors wanted him to do.
Right.
Yeah. For instance, just to give you an example, I mean, I was never invited to participate in these breakfast shows at all, not even once, because my views were known about these things here. So, yeah.
Let me turn to, thank you for that. Let me turn to one of the key issues that was explored at the Zondo Commission. I want to ask your view on cadre deployment. Now, there's some people who would argue strongly that this has been one of the key factors leading to the weaknesses and a lot of the corruption that has taken place in the state-owned enterprises and elsewhere. Now, the current president, Mr. Ramaphosa, at the Zondo Commission said that he wanted cadre deployment to continue. He thought this was for all sorts of reasons. The Minister of Finance, on the other hand, has said that the aims of transformation in terms of racially transforming the state have been overachieved in many respects, and that in his view, it's time to end cadre deployment. How do you see this issue, and where do you stand on the debate?
Well, it's what has happened is really a misnomer. It's not even cadre deployment. As far as I know, even when I was Secretary General of the ANC, there was a deployment committee chaired by the Deputy President, who was Jacob Zuma, and the Deputy Secretary General was the Administrative Secretary to that committee. And it never ever had the role, even as early as that time, of appointing people into public office. Its role was to encourage cadres to apply and go to interviews in the formal interviews. But there was never any authority of such a committee deploying anyone directly. They had to apply, like you had to encourage them to apply, and you could only encourage those who had the requisite qualifications to do so. And so the other than advisors are normally appointed simply because the principal knows the advisor and needs the support and services of an advisor. In the formal positions, there's no such authority whatsoever. So I think there has been a misrepresentation, misinformation about the deployment committee role. When I was deputy president of the ANC, I never chaired any single meeting of the deployment committee, not one, because there was no role for it. There was absolutely no role for the deployment committee.
Perhaps it changed after you were deputy president. We know that as deputy president, Mr. Ramaphosa was chairman of the deployment committee from 2012 to 2017, yeah. And seemed to have had a different role from your experience with it.
Well, that's the impression I get, that the justification seems to suggest that it had a different role, and because you see, and the late Professor Sten Sangweni was an expert on statecraft, and one of the points that he always emphasized was that the appointment of senior managers in the public service is vested in the president, and the president delegates that authority by proclamation to his ministers. So ordinarily what then happens is, if there's a vacancy of a director general or DDG in any ministry, or department, the line function minister invites 2 colleagues from cabinet, and the 3 of them, together with a DG from another department, constitute themselves into an interviewing panel. So the post would have been advertised, and Professor Sten Sangweni says that's how far transparency goes, just the advert of the post. From that point onwards, everything else is not transparent, is not rigorous. And his recommendation was that the president should rather delegate that authority to the Public Service Commission. And the Public Service Commission should not itself act as an interviewing panel. It should put together experts and practitioners in that field who will then conduct the interview and make recommendations. In the same way as the Judicial Service Commission conducts interviews for judges, and that's what we should do if we want to have a capable state, because that way you then are assured of selecting the best talent available in the country. His argument was that if you don't, he says, the ministers may not even have a sense of whether this well-certificated candidate is suited for purpose, is fit for purpose. And if, so he says you need experts and practitioners in that field who must conduct the interview. Then you will be assured of selecting the best talent available in the country. And that's how we would, have build a capable state. If I may, by way of illustration, the best department in government that I know of has always been science and technology. And I'll tell you why. Because the Director General and all the senior managers have been there over the years. It's the ministers who come and go, not the other way around. In all the other departments, there's a high turnover of senior managers, from director generals and so on. Every other day they are leaving, and ministers want to appoint, new people and so on. And that's what is being misunderstood and misconstrued as cadre development, cadre deployment. It's not cadre deployment. That's something else. It's just a wrong way of, exercising this authority of appointing senior man. Because you see, the science and technology example tells us that over time, you then have institutional memory and the requisite expertise in that department. It's always been like that.
So, in short, you would be saying that the reason we had such inappropriate people heading up the state-owned enterprises throughout most of the 2010s was because of inappropriate appointment processes and had nothing really to do with ANC deployment. Is that
it had absolutely nothing to do with ANC deployment, because remember, as I said earlier on, the ANC was already captured. So you then have this excuse of people who are being, thrown into the deep end, precisely so that they know themselves that they don't qualify to be appointed in those positions, and so they feel highly indebted to those who appointed them, and that's why they cannot take professional decisions and principled positions.
Well, this is a very important debate. Thank you for your interpretation of what happened and your understanding. Let me come to the present now. Last year, you said that ANC factions, both the CR17 and the so-called RET faction, could destroy the ANC. That you said this in the context of the enormous conflicts and disputes that took place around the selection of the lists for the local government elections. What did you mean exactly? How do you see this conflict within the ANC, the factions, and what's going on, and what's really worrying for you?
Well, once again, I mean, the problem here was that people were openly, trying to populate the list of candidates along factional lines, and openly so. So if people say, look, in this region, the dominant faction is RET, and we are CR17, and you have to ask the question, where is the ANC in all of this? Because the ANC can't accept to exist only in the form of factions. Otherwise, it might as well close shop. The ANC has got to resist being reduced to factions, and so people were openly saying, no, we don't want this person because he's a RET or he's CR17, and so we had to raise it with the National Executive Committee. As the Electoral Committee, we had to report to them and say, look, this is what is going on in your names. And so you must act against these people. Don't look the other way simply because they pledge support to you, and so they're doing wrong things in your names. That's a context in which we actually raise this issue.
Wow. So how do you feel about the country today? Are we making sufficient progress in reforming South Africa, the government and its laws, so that we can get growth and employment? Or is it not taking place fast enough? How do you feel about where we are today as you and I talk this afternoon?
Well, and you know, we suffer from a number of handicaps. Key among the handicaps is our education system. We must fix our basic education system. We must try and you know, get the German TVET system to import that and try and implement it, because our TVET colleges aren't producing the skills that are sorely needed by our economy. And so if we are doing poorly in artisanal skills, then it makes it this much more difficult to grow the economy. And you'll recall that in the high-level panel, one of the recommendations was that, you know, given our levels of unemployment, we should try and get Parliament to even amend the Labor Relations Act to create space for, you know, small entrepreneurs and operators, and exempt them from, you know, being compelled to live up to the standards of the collective bargaining councils, which have well-organized unions on the one side and big employers on the other. And so the small employers are compelled by law to implement what is agreed to by the bigger employers. And we basically recommended that there should be flexibility there, and that could only be done by amending the Labor Relations Act and you know, allowing small employers the flexibility, as long as you know, the registration of small enterprises doesn't take long. So you make sure that if someone needs a license to open a small enterprise, they should be able to get the license within a month at most. And once they have the license and they are registered, don't rush into bringing them into the tax bracket, as it were. I think, you know, if I look at the taxi industry for years, they were not paying tax. And today it's a massive industry, massive. And now, and they are organized such that you can now, SARS can easily bring them, you know, into the bracket of taxpayers now. But if you try to do that when they are still, you know, at their fledgling stage and struggling, then you just suffocate them, and you will not be able to address our levels of unemployment. In fact, we should be establishing microfinancing facilities in these townships and poor communities, so that people can at least have access to startup capital. And if one person sets up an operation which employs 2 other people, leave them. Government should not interfere with them. Leave them, give them breathing space. That's how you deal with high levels of unemployment. Yeah.
I think it was really striking in the high-level panel report to Parliament that you chaired that you argued this. As a former trade unionist, you seemed convinced of this argument for much greater sort of flexibility and breathing space for small firms, at least, to not have to conform with the standards and the high standards of much bigger companies and highly organized unions. Why is it so hard to persuade everyone of this? And are you optimistic we are getting anywhere on that topic?
Well, as I said, if the way to go about it is really to establish microfinancing, micro-lending, offices closest to the unemployed people. And those of them who, see opportunities, have the possibility. You don't have to ask for, serious business plans. There are plumbers who, in the townships, design and make beautifully looking gates, and they use public transport to go and buy the raw material. They make these gates. And they have no way of marketing them. They just, place it there outside the gate, and passers-by can then see and end up. So someone like that may actually just need startup capital to buy a bakkie so that he can, employ 2 other people and so on. It's that kind of thing that I think, would help us to address these high levels of unemployment. Create the opportunity and provide the wherewithal for people who would employ 3, 5, the other people. That way, you create also local economies, because the resources then circulate there. So when the recipients of social grants receive their social grants, they also buy from the local economy. That's the way to go. And unless we do that, other than agriculture, I don't see how we can create labor-intensive, sectors that would create jobs, because the only way to reduce poverty is actually to get people to work. Yeah.
Well, I couldn't agree more with that. One of the other positions that the high-level panel took and recommended to Parliament was about tribal land. So let me ask you a direct question. In your view, should unelected chiefs continue to exercise the powers that they have in South Africa's democracy?
Well, the structure of traditional leadership in the rural areas is recognized in the Constitution. How we got to deal with this issue, because we were looking at legislation. And one of the acts we came across was the Ingonyama Trust Act, which we found to be unconstitutional, and also it had being amended to create a board, and the board was essentially forcing households to sign up leases. They were forcing people in the rural communities within the Ngonyama Trust lands to convert their permissions to occupy into leases, and they were then, and the lease came with preconditionalities, and they had to pay rent. So the board was collecting rent from rural poor households, and thanks to the rural women's movement, they took the matter of the board taking rent from them to court, and on the 11th of June last year, the High Court in Pietermaritzburg found in their favor, and actually the order was that the board should reimburse them of all the rental money that was collected from them, and the Minister of Rural Development and Land Reform had sided with the Ingonyama Trust Board. So the court also found against it, and actually imposed certain responsibilities on that office. What we also got to understand was that the traditional land use management systems had collapsed completely, even in other jurisdictions under traditional leaders that fell outside of the Ngonyama Trust Act. We found that that had actually been completely done away with, and there were no systems, there was no reliable register, and the traditional land use management system always valued, sources of water. So if there's a river running through the village, they wouldn't allow anyone to build there next to it. Those would be reserved for tilling and planting, and residential areas would be designated elsewhere. But that system was gone, and we also looked at the security of tenure for farm dwellers, and recommended that it should be secured in law in the same way as the security of tenure of rural dwellers under the jurisdiction of traditional leaders. We said their rights should be secured in law, in legislation. Yeah, so that they should not be subjected to the whims and idiosyncratic problems of chiefs. Yeah.
Very important issue. We're coming to the end of our time, about 8 minutes to go. I want to ask two more questions.
Okay.
My first one is, how do you feel today? Where are we now? Can the ANC become a leader in society again, morally, politically, and ethically? What's your view of this? Paulo Jordan, for example, rather controversially has written that the ANC should just close up shop and claim its proud legacy of the past, and new politicians or new political parties should emerge. What is your view? Can the ANC really reform and become a contributor to South Africa in a very positive way again?
Yeah. Well, I think the ANC is within its right to embark on efforts to renew itself and so on. However, the South Africans shouldn't be bound by that timetable. South Africa should move on, and at whatever point when the ANC believes it's now a renewed formation, it must catch up with South Africa. And I'm saying this because I think the results of the elections in 2016 as well as last year indicate that we are in a period of our polity being in a state of flux, which must necessarily result in an realignment of political forces. I don't think the current political parties represent the future. I think the kind of formations that are going to take this country forward are still to become, and they will be fashioned by a realignment of force, because we still need a clearer. I mean, you have parties that are in parliament that are dead set against the constitution. You have parties that don't recognize parts of the national anthem, and they are in parliament, and it's an anomaly. It's an anomaly. It just goes to show that there's going to be a realignment, I think, and the parties that are going to be serious players going forward are still to emerge.
Interesting. Some parts of certain parties don't seem to recognize the Constitution while others do. That's an interesting view. Let me turn to a very different subject. Yeah. And my last question then is about foreign affairs. What is your view on Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I take the view that any war doesn't start on the day the first shots are fired. There's always a build-up, and in that lead-up period, there are opportunities for, acting in a way that would avoid the eventuality of the outbreak of a war. We are a good example in that regard. There was a build-up in this country of, forces of apartheid on the one side and forces that wanted to destroy apartheid on the other side. And before these forces, the apartheid government was armed to the teeth, and people even believed that it was invincible, and yet, because your armed forces are there to protect a system that is untenable, it was clear that it was not sustainable. But when the opportunity presented itself for these antagonists to sit around the table, that opportunity was grabbed with both hands, and this is where we are today. So I'm saying, in the situation of Russia and Ukraine, there no doubt were opportunities that could have prevented the actual outbreak of the war. Once those opportunities were not seized, then the war, once it broke out, it's a no-win situation, not for the Ukrainians, not for the Russians. In fact, President Putin did not give the full account to the Duma, which is their parliament. He simply said, we need to recognize the Donbas region, these republics, they are populated by Russians and they are being persecuted and bombed. We need to protect them. And that's what the Duma gave approval of. And he went beyond that. So the Russians themselves sit with a war that they did not approve of. And so to me, that's something that should be condemned. But you know, you have to locate that within the arrogance of you know, the powerful. The powerful always think that they can overrun, you know, their adversaries, and no doubt Putin thought he would just overrun the Ukraine. In the same way, on our continent, when in Ethiopia, the federal government, you know, got into a conflictual situation with the TPLF in Tigray, we went and pleaded with the prime minister when it was, you know, like the first week with President Chisano and President Helen Johnson Sirleaf, and tried to persuade him that, look, let's identify interlocutors and nip this in the bud, silence the guns. And he said, no, this is not a conflict. We don't need anyone's assistance. This is not a conflict. It's a law enforcement issue. We know the 60 criminals in the TPLF who are involved in this rebellion, and we're going to arrest them. That's how he characterized it. Today, that war is still raging, but his attitude was informed by the fact that he thought the federal, you know, forces are more powerful. They would just overrun. We've seen this from a number of members of the Security Council who, you know that the Security Council can't do anything because they enjoy the veto power. So they've had turns in that regard, and this raises the whole question of the architecture of the UN General Assembly as well as the UN Security Council. It also raises questions even about international sporting federations, whose charters. I mean, I was amazed by FIFA, for instance, that FIFA's charter stipulates that should a government of an affiliated association interfere in sport, they would immediately take steps to censure that country, either by expelling the federation or, you know, suspending it. In this case, they simply suspended the Russian Federation, not because the Russian government interfered in sport, instead because it invaded the Ukraine, which means the separation of sport and politics is again called into question. I don't know how they're going to sustain their principles beyond when the blood is staunched and guns are silenced and the dust has settled down. The same applies to these oligarchs whose monies were good monies in the, you know, several countries in Europe, and by a stroke of a pen they've been frozen, no process. So going forward, how are they going to say protection of property is sacrosanct? So the war, I think, throws all of these questions into the air, but the war itself should be condemned. There's no prevarication about it, because no war ever solves problems. And the notion of declaring, you know, the war to end all wars is flawed. It's flawed. So my take on the Russian, invasion of the Ukraine is that it should be condemned. But I've seen, analysis that indicates that, in fact, the real problem is not even the Ukraine, is the German economy in terms of geopolitics here. But that's a debate for another day. Yeah.
Well, Mr. President, there's a lot to debate here, but sadly we've come to the end of our hour. Thank you very much for giving us this time and for speaking so generously and frankly about how you see our history and our present. I'm really grateful for you to join us today. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We've come to the end of our conversation, and I look forward to seeing everyone next time. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you. And thank you all, the participants.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're